Well, thanks again for the invitation. We actually had planned an expert meeting on archiving the digital at the CCA today and tomorrow, but we postponed it to next week in order to for me to be here, and also I had some other objectives for postponing. But no, thank you very much for the invitation. I think it is telling that we're working on this, and a lot of people we were just talking over lunch, that although it is still very complex and very difficult for institutions, for architectural offices and so on, and for everyone who's involved, and at the same time, I think also for, well, now we can see also some perspectives, or let's say some horizon to the issues that we deal with. While I think 5 or 10 years ago, I think David was mentioning it was kind of all closed doors that you kind of experienced. So it's very challenging, I think, nowadays. The Archaeology of the Digital project, how do I do? This way, is a very, very big project for CCA and at CCA. We're based in Montreal, not in New York or not in, let's say, center of the world, but kind of periphery. Which also allows us to do things that maybe are not so much seen, which is perhaps sometimes good. But the project is basically, it started with a discussion with Greg Lynn, ultimately the curator of this show and the next show. I'll tell you about that. I think you know who he is, architect in Los Angeles, and to start a project to investigate the digital in architecture, because let's say from 1985 until today, but maybe not till today, let's say until 2002, 2005, the digital, as I think Kurt was saying in his introduction, really changed architectural design and architectural thinking of design. So it's not only about creating records and creating data, but it really, really changed the design process, and it really changed the thinking of architects. For our built environment, but also for our unbuilt environment. So we were trying to understand how to capture this moment. So we asked Greg to select 25 projects that we would then try to collect. Not sure if it's going to happen, but we're going to try to collect by donation. So to ask the architects to donate these projects to the CCA to do research on these projects. But not only research, we also wanted to present this to the public through exhibitions, through publications, both in print form and on the web. Also to provide, let's say, to establish a project with oral history in which the CCA has a tradition, but to, let's say, to really capture this moment, not only by collecting material, but also to collect the stories. I'll come back to that later. And now we are, let's say, 1-2 years on the way, and we had this summer a conference, toolkit conference as it was called, with PhD students from all over. And now we're going to have next week this other expert meeting in Montreal. So this is the first exhibition. It opened in May. It's going to be closing next week and next Sunday, so hurry up, I'd say. Or book your flights. It starts with the first 4 projects that Greg had chosen. Here you see Peter Eisenman in the front, of which CCA had the archive, though that was fairly simple. Frank Geary's Lewis House. Shoyo, you see in the back, a Japanese architect, and Chuck Hoagman from New York, who is more into, let's say, the moving, everything that is moving, the robotics, through digital development. These 4, let's say, 4 architects, or 4 that represent also another group of architects, of course, they kind of give you the directions or the trajectories of the digital architecture. So it kind of, it is one explanation, of course, it's Greg's explanation too, let's be fair, and about what the digital architecture is about. And then you have, let's say, 4 rooms. In each room, one project is really explained. And the interesting thing is that it's a fairly paper-based exhibition. It's not that digital at all. It's very hybrid still, as you say, although there is some digital. But for example, you see screens in the, let's say, the far corner. You see the room of Frank Gehry. You see screens. And actually, these are slides, let's say, digitized slides of his screenshots. So at that time that he was working on the Lewis House, early 90s, he was not able to make a print screen, a screenshot of his screen. And so he just took a photograph or a slide with a analog camera. And then these slides were digitized, so it's a very odd. There you see, and another which I thought was interesting in the presentation. I think it was your presentation. You started with the machines, actually what we did was to find the machines that were important for these 4 projects and to really link them. This was actually the most difficult part of the exhibition because it was very, very difficult to find the machines. We had to go to eBay, to very obscure sellers in Montreal to find old machines and manuals. But for example, for the Peter Eisenman project, the Frankfurt Buurtzentrum, it was FedEx was very important, and also FedEx just came about. It was actually the start of FedEx because he was working with the Ohio State University with this project, and they were working, let's say, they were working in the office, sending drawings overnight by FedEx to the Ohio State. They were, let's say, putting those in the computer and then sending it back overnight by FedEx. Although, by the way, Peter Eisenman tells us that he never ever used a computer. But I mean, the proof is in the pudding. This is about the exhibition. This exhibition is going to travel first to Yale to begin with, and then it's going to travel further on. We have because I said there were 25 projects, so we're going to have 2 more exhibitions at least, and each one will present a group. The next exhibition will be with 6 architects. 6 projects, I have to say. It's not about the architects, it's about the projects. And 6 projects that will deal with more the interactive issues of the digital, the experience, the reaction of the body and the machine and so on. Total different exhibition, total different group of people. But this project is also more. The 2 top photographs you see, Mirko Tardini, the director of CCA, Greg Lynn, and in this case Tom Main, and then their asymptote, Hani Rashid, because we visit all the offices before we start to work with them. So we visit them, we talk, we come. Greg has selected project A of this office, and then while talking we come to other conclusions and so on. So it's a really time-consuming project. And then we discuss this in a small group, again with Greg here. This is the small group. I have this pointer. The small group and another small group, and then ultimately also in a large group. And I'm telling you this because for CCA this is a very non-standard production or project, because as these projects were very collaborative, and you can see that, say, you never talk only with the one architect that owns the project. You also talk to all these designers that were involved, or to the young students at that time that were involved, because we really have to understand these projects from scratch. And it also means for us that we really have to share all this knowledge, which is, again, very time consuming. So we talk a lot in the Institute with, let's say, from the curator to the conservator or the curatorial assistant, because it really is about gaining knowledge and sharing this knowledge, not be protective about this knowledge, so really to be open, because I think this is also coming with the project itself. But then, okay, before I come to that. So I said it's 25 projects, and I also have to say that it is not the standard project. I briefly mentioned that. These 25 projects are really the most complicated project you can imagine. These are projects of which sometimes hardly anything is left. That's why we call this the archaeology of the digital, because we already acknowledge that a lot has been lost, which is a relief for me, I have to say, because I don't have to bother about that. But it's really, I am not pretending at all, none of us, that we can retrieve everything and we can find everything or we can rebuild everything. Not at all. If we're lucky, we find the code, and if we're lucky, we can open documents and we can open files. We were very pessimistic in the beginning, and I have to say I'm getting more and more optimistic about the result of, let's say, giving access to these files that we collect, but it didn't, let's say, it didn't stop us from doing it, because we acknowledge that we will not be able to rediscover the project or reinvent the project or redo the project or represent the project. We acknowledge the loss, and we'll see, maybe in the future there'll be ways to open in another way files and so on. Also, we consider this ultimately as a research project. So the collection is a research collection, and we'll find ways to present this to the public, to publish it, or to do whatever is necessary to, let's say, reinstall a project. But in essence, it's very much a research project. I think one thing I have to mention before I go to the more, let's say, technical part of my presentation is that can't remember who said, I think it was David mentioning that it was not easy to find the right people to work on this, on these kind of things, because let's say the traditional archivists have no real knowledge about architectural digital design, and if you speak to all the digital designers or the architects, they don't understand, not all of them understand the real problem with access and user access and so on, all the things that we think about as collection or archivists. And luckily we did find young people to help us, architects in fact. It was interesting to come from the architecture faculty in Montreal. Some people that are, let's say, they are trained as architects, but they're very, very interested in the historical, very recent history, but let's say historical aspect of it. All born natives, I would say, all born after 1980, but and it's very, very interesting to work with them because they're super quick with everything. They understand the incompatibility of all the systems and so on. So that's very, very nice. But you absolutely need to find these people before you can do anything at all. Okay, so then we'll talk to these architects, we have conversations, they acknowledge that it is an interesting project and so on. And then we come to the moment that we actually talking about receiving these projects for the archive and for the collection. As was said, I think already, it starts with contracts and deed of gifts. Very complicated, because what is an original? What is a duplicate? How is it with copyrights and so on? I have to say, whatever we do, we come back to what we do with the paper archives, ultimately. Yeah, that's a kind of thing of fallback. Okay, how did we organize this in the beginning with the paper archives? And it kind of leads you to a common understanding, and also an understanding that we might not be able to understand everything right now, but it should not stop us from doing. So we have the, let's say we come to an agreement with an architect, and then it starts, we try to receive these projects. But before we receive it, we send out a questionnaire, because this was said as well this morning, that you need to understand what you're receiving, because you cannot receive a hard drive with thousands and thousands and thousands of images and files and complicated media, including Santa Claus pictures and no, really, you get everything. And so you have to understand what you're receiving, which is, by the way, also not easy for the architects to understand. Because in our conversation, quite often it takes, let's say, 2 or 3 hours before they think, okay. So we spoke, for example, with Carl Chu, now at Pratt, And he once was very important in the paperless studio and in a lot of, let's say, in the realm of Greg Lynn and Hani Rashid. And he invented a kind of machine and also projects, X-Phylum, for example. And he showed me TIFFs. He said, this is what I have, this is what I have, this is the only thing I have. I said, well, but it's a TIFF. You must have something which the TIFF is made of. I mean, the TIFF doesn't, it's not born by itself, you know, it's not an original, in that sense, it's not an original document. And he said, no, this is what I have. I said, no, you must have, or maybe you had, maybe you don't have it anymore, but I mean, what is the TIFF made of? Yeah, no, you're not interested in this. Very, very boring wireframe drawings. I said, yes, but we're interested in the wireframe drawings and the TIFFs and the machine and everything you have. And then he said, no, but listen, these are with some young guys in LA or Las Vegas or wherever these guys were in some kind of software company, you know. It was, and so it took really, I said, but you know, do you have notes? Did you write anything down? No, you're not interested in that. I said, yes, we're interested in everything. Everything that is physical and everything that is digital related to the project. But it really took a while before he understood. In another case, I was explaining the project by phone to an architect, and he said, yeah, that's fine. No, it's fine. I'm going to send it to you now. And let's say 5 minutes later, he sent me all the files by WeTransfer to me. But I don't want to receive this on my computer. So we really, let's say, we go through all these phases, and you adjust according to these phases, learning by doing really. So we now have established another procedure. Then it's the registrars who ultimately, if they're sent anything by WeTransfer, it goes to registrars. It all seems very logical, but you know, also to explain to this architect that he should not be sending these files to me, it's very complicated. So why not? I mean, yeah, then you have it. And actually, it turned out that this was only the website files that he sent me. And we said, but why? I mean, again, the same question as with Karel Schuh, and he said, well, yeah, no, I don't have this anymore. And then on a Tuesday morning, he called me and said, actually, I found a very, very old computer, and I think the hard drive in this computer has all the files. But I'm moving out my house. That's how we found the computer. So can I send it to you now? I said, well, okay. So he sent it. It was the most dusty object we ever received at CCA. And it was the computer, the whole computer he sent. And we were able to retrieve the hard drive. And yes, the hard drive was full of unorganized files, folders, everything from, let's say, invoices to the nanny, or from the nanny to the project itself, and not easy to deal with. I'll come to that later. But these are kind of let's say, it tells you a little bit about what kind of reality you're facing when you're doing these projects. So it takes a lot of time. This is a kind of scheme that we made just to understand. We're let's say, making these schemes on the floor. I have to say, for us, the Oasis model is the starting point. That's absolutely sure. So, and I was just saying during lunch that we started with adjusting the Oasis model in a huge model. This is only actually, this is a simple model related in comparison to the model that we started with. We started to expand the Oasis model to that, I think you showed it. And it was enormous. And actually, while doing it, we cut off certain steps. We thought this is not necessary. We found out that certain parts were not, let's say, not useful for CCA purposes and so on. So now we have, this is the most simple model that we have now, which is still very complicated, I think. I think in a year's time it will be half of this model. Maybe it's only the Oasis model that we get to. But as I say, first you have the let's say, before anything arrives at the CCA. And also we try to understand who is involved in this process. So it's me as the director of the collection. ideally, we have a digital archivist. We don't have one yet, but we're going to post soon. But and we don't know what this person is, but we'll see who applies for the job. And what is very important, this part, is the questionnaire. As I said, besides, let's say, discussing with the architects the project and getting as much information as possible, we send out a questionnaire which is asking very basic questions. When did you do this project? Who was involved? Was it only people of your office, or were you collaborating with many other people? What kind of software did you use? What kind of hardware did you use? Very, very basic questions, but we try to receive this information before we get anything. Then also you have to understand what you get ultimately. So this is more this, also to kind of establish a deed of gift, because you can mention the deed of gift, we get one hard drive. Well, then you at least have something physical that you receive, but what is on the hard drive? I mean, and do you have to be precise on this? These are all kind of questions that we face, and we'll do on the flow, basically. We have a processing plan, which is again a kind of form that we made up, and just to establish the steps, especially when it comes to these files or project that we receive when there's nothing physical, so no hard drive, no USB stick, no CD, but just by WeTransfer, you want to have something. In a way, it's very odd in this digital era, but you want to have something physical. So we just have a paper, and we write, okay, we received on this date, we receive it. I think ultimately we're not going to use this paper anymore, but let's say for this period, I think for all of us in the institution also to communicate, it was super important to understand. And actually the questionnaire is also very interesting in the communication with the architects, because also they start to think about what they're donating. At first they have actually no clue. They say, oh yeah, you can have the files, no problem. But then when they start to think, and when they have to write this, give the answers to the questionnaire, also let's say third parties' rights and so on, all the copyrights issues, everything is asked in this questionnaire. And actually then they also, it is kind of emancipation process, I would say, that both parties understand better what they're doing. The processing plan is also linked in our museum system, in the TMS, in the system where we catalog and use for our collection, and as well as, I mean, whatever information, also the questionnaire is linked to this system. So if we receive ultimately these data or the files or whatever, in whatever format, we already have, let's say, a certain kind of information. And of course with the paper archive, you would also like to have some information before you receive a truck with 100 models. But in a way, let's say in this case, I think also in this stage in which we are now, it's more important to receive that. Well, then you have the reception of the files, as I said. I mean, first they all sent it to me because I was their contact person, and they understood me, they knew me. And now, luckily, we have established a better procedure, so now it goes officially to the registrar, and it goes in a kind of shipping space, as we call it, just as we have a shipping space for physical models or physical material. We have a shipping space for material that we receive and that we cannot immediately ingest. Then you have the, let's say, the process of file. I'm not going to go too deep because otherwise it gets too boring. The file processing, for which the harvester or any type of forensics is super important. And because we have developed now a harvester, but I mean, you can also get things off the shelf, that tells you that whether they're duplicates, whether they're viruses, corrupted files, so you can actually, you kind of scan, it's an MRE scan actually, that just tells you what is on this hard drive, and that also tells you, let's say, all the extensions. So already by seeing the extensions, you kind of understand how complicated it will be to do the next steps. Then you have the, let's say, the kind of classification of the data that you receive, and ultimately it will go, of course, in the dark archive, and then you go to the next step. I have to say we kind of cover now, I feel confident to say that we're kind of we managed to be, we're kind of here. We have, I think, established a fairly smooth procedure until harvesting, and now also we have made the next step, which is, let's say, the basic logical schema, which is a kind of classification scheme. I'll come to that. And the next step will be to put everything from the shipping space, in fact, to the dark archive, clean, no viruses, no corrupted files, and so forth.
Martine, is the shipping space quarantined?
Yeah. So we're taking it step by step. And just to wrap up this, before we receive the material, as you see, so we kind of make this checklist for ourselves, and also to, before we receive this, there's what do we have to do? We have to send a questionnaire to the donor. I'll be quick. And you have to receive it back and forth. I'll show you later what happens. Oh, sorry. And then you have, this is all, let's say, before the material arrives. And then when it starts to arrive, you have the registrar making the TMS record. You make the shipping, you kind of prepare the shipping space, etc. Then you have the stage of reception, and you, do whatever is needed, update the TMS records if necessary. And if you've done that, kind of the basic preservation is complete. As I say, we have this, I received this schedule last Friday. That was where I was late with sending it, because on Monday there was an updated version, and we said, well, you know what, we're going to do things in a little bit more simple way. So I really have to say, now that we're receiving a lot of material, we're really making steps day by day. Then you have the harvesting, as I said, it generates reports, and it generates, actually that's very important, a access copy, a preservation copy, and that is important for whatever we do with the exhibition and the publication, because of course the people of programs and exhibitions, they want to start looking at this material before we have done anything with it. Then you have the SIP production and the ingest. And with this ingest is interesting. As I said, we have we came to this kind of basic logical scheme, which is this is the scheme. And we had one project which is fairly good organized, the Muscle by Cas Oosterhuis, he sent us. And we just took it from there, his project, and we just tried to name the categories. And let's say we had discussions back and forth about what the categories could be naming. What was a very important understanding is to call this design. We at first had architectural drawings, but that does not cover it all. So then later we said, no, we have to call this design. It can be videos, it can be anything, but it's let's say it could be any kind of document, but it does not have to be necessarily an architectural drawing, which is part of the design phase. Well, I think, let's say, these kind of classifications is fairly straightforward, actually, and it may not be fitting for every single project. We'll see. And then, let's say, this is how we could let's say you have one package of data that the donor sends in the dark archive, in the way he sent it, or she, the donor, sent it. And then we try to make it accessible for other people to understand. Then you get this curatorial part, or let's say the cataloging part. So we then kind of reconfigure if that is necessary, into this let's say the basic logical scheme. And for example, this screenshot is a screenshot of design, and I wanted to show it to you because, let's say, we kept his folder structure, so we're not moving any single document, single AutoCAD drawing with 25 layers to another folder. We keep his folder structure, and let's say all the capitalized is what we add as explanation. Again, maybe this is not necessary anymore in 1 year, but for us now to understand what we're looking at, and also to communicate with other people in the institution, it's very important. So this is our explanation, and this is the let's say it's just how we received it. So we will not, we might move a folder with 1,000 drawings, whatever, but we will not move one drawing to another folder. I have to say, again, the proof is in the pudding. I'm not sure we can maintain this, because if we receive very unorganized data, like this hard drive with a lot of data, then you might have to do things. We'll see. But the interesting thing is now, for example, with Tom Main, he called me and he said, you know what, we're now preparing all the files for you. How would you actually like to receive it? And luckily, let's say the week before, we just had established this kind of scheme. And I could say, well, if possible, you could send it according to this scheme. I have to say we had a discussion at the institution, because you also, I mean, there's also something as the integrity of an archive. You keep the order of an archive as it was ideally in an office. But I have to say, sometimes it's not possible. Even with physical material, you have to reconfigure, because it's just otherwise impossible to give access to. So in the end, we said, no, I mean, if you use this schema, it would be actually much more interesting for us, because we can actually easier access it, which I think in this stage is more important than, I mean, he can take a screenshot, or he can send us, let's say, the original scheme that he or that their original workflow, how it was organized, but not, let's say, we might not use that. But as I said, I think what is very important that someone said to me in one of my staff members said to me, you know, it's like driving a car with a manual on your lap. And that is really what it is for us, you know. So we're not, we're kind of, I think there's a lot of examples that we use, like Oasis. I mean, you don't have to start from scratch, but you have to learn a lot while doing. And then the most crucial, and let's say the most important, also the most difficult question for us is ultimately your question about curation. So you receive all these AutoCAD drawings, and each AutoCAD drawing has 25 layers or 50 layers. And it was actually Lars Spijbroek with whom we had a discussion, and he said, you know, how can you decide which layer of this one drawing of these in the 25 layers of this drawing, which is the one that is really key for the design? He couldn't actually remember. So I said, well, I don't know either. But this is the real difficult issue. I want to add one more thing, because we do give access now to specific researchers that come through a virtual computer, which is a kind of an enclosed environment. But they have to come to CCA, very ironically, for digital files. But because we cannot give yet secure environment, let's say through the web or online, so we give access to, on a virtual computer, to all the files. I think only Maya drawings are difficult with that, but let's say all the rest is available. So that's how far we are.
Thank you very much.